a lot for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here, and also maybe to contribute to the reflection based on the previous speaker, because there are aspects that the LCA community is already addressing, and also the policy system is already addressing. So maybe we can start from there, our reflection. So just for those of you that doesn't know, what is the Joint Research Center? Is the technical and scientific arm of the European Commission. We do policy support, basically in many different areas, and specifically I'm the coordinator of the European Platform on Life Cycle Assessment. So all the activities that part of the Commission staff is doing in trying to have more robust and comparable LCA-based studies. Now let's start with let's say a question on what we need to deliver to improve food sustainability. And there are several elements of this sustainability. One of them is basically that we need to contribute to sustainable development goals. And if we look at these goals, they're various. They're addressing environmental, social, and economic aspects. In many cases, just defining targets as, let's say, somehow defining objectives that we have to reach, or we can also consider them a sort of limit within which we may consider ourselves sustainable. The other key element is to be able to address trade-offs of the food system, because the pillars of the food system, which are the food safety, the food security, and the sustainability of the food, are actually creating some trade-offs. Maybe to be sure we are able to deliver food to people with the food security, we may end up having then some issues or trade-off in the sustainability domain. Sorry, this is something else. Okay, so in the food safety domain, we mainly want to ensure that food doesn't cause harm to people. And the fact that healthy people, healthy environment, and healthy animals are three important pillars of this element of the food safety. In the food security, this is very much related to the availability, to the access, to the stability, and to the level of utilization of the food, not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries, so really with a global perspective. And then sustainability. And here, the objective or the ambition is to ensure that food system is within planetary boundaries. So not only on the constraints that could be a land constraints, as mentioned by the previous speaker, so an amount of productive land that we have available that we have not to surpass, but also many other carrying capacity related aspects that could be related to the nutrient balance, to the geochemical balance in general, but also to level of biodiversity loss and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the issue of addressing the socioeconomic impacts, because very often we may able to have a certain level of food security. So we secure food for developing countries, for example, at the expenses of socioeconomic impacts that are happening in the related supply chains. So in the Farm to Fork, which is one of the key policies of the Green Deal, there are a number of key actions. And in this key action, life cycle assessment and life cycle thinking, I would say, so the bigger family of those approaches that are addressing the entire supply chain have a role. The actions are spelled out in the policies mainly as the need to reduce environmental and climate footprint of the EU food system, to ensure all food that is placed on the EU market is increasingly more sustainable, with a lot of discussion what doesn't mean being sustainable for the food system, but also the improvement of synergies with sectorial legislation, because the food supply chain is a very complex supply chain that it has, of course, interaction not only with the primary production, so for those policies like the common agricultural policy, but also many other policies that has to do with the distribution and retail, with the manufacturing, with the management of the food waste at the end of life. So in total, the Farm to Fork has 27 actions. And the role of life cycle thinking and life cycle assessment is pretty clear. Already from the title of this policy initiative, From Farm to Fork, it's the first time ever we have a policy in place for food in which the entire supply chain is involved. So I will just illustrate you some example of the work that the Joint Research Center is doing in support to different aspects of this circle using life cycle assessment or life cycle thinking. The first action in this among these 27 actions is called Proposal for a Legislative Framework for Sustainable Food System. This is a sort of umbrella policy initiative in which the idea is really to be able to have definitions of what sustainability, at least in a EU system, might mean for the food, but also to then defining the principles for further legislations that will address sustainability of food along the entire supply chain. Then there is a work, one of these actions, the 27, that is very much focused on the organic production, the assessment of the primary production and the, let's say, added value of the organic. Another is more specifically, I'm not sure you can see here, the proposal for a sustainable food labeling framework. This is, of course, a big challenge for the LCA domain, and as the idea is to be able also to provide consumers with information on the environmental profile of the food, so the performance aspect of the food that is produced and consumed. Then there are aspects, another initiative related to the green public procurement, so the fact of having criteria for food that is then bought by the public, where again the environmental performances are the best possible. And then it was mentioned as well before by the previous speaker, the big challenge of the food waste. There are specific intervention in the policy framework or the Farm to Fork for defining food waste prevention targets. And also there is a role for LCA, because not all the food prevention is by definition sustainable or better. We have to identify which are those actions that are maximizing the benefit while reducing the trade-offs. In this respect, there is also another initiative launched by the European Parliament, which is named Consumer Food Waste. I will explain you briefly what it is about. And then again, there are several aspects related to the LCA in the definition of the monitoring framework for the Farm to Fork. Every European policy initiative is accompanied by a monitoring framework with indicators that are helping the policymakers to understand if we are delivering or not the ambitions of the policy initiative. And there, the headlines indicator needs to be indicator not only of specific aspects, how much primary production, how much safety control and things like that, but also at system level, if the system overall is bringing us towards more sustainable or unsustainable trends. So, as I mentioned, I will just give you an overview very quickly, but just to have an idea that LCA or also life cycle thinking, it's really very cross-cutting on the key and the underpinning questions of food sustainability. On one end, more on the life cycle thinking domain, we are supporting with material flow analysis and analysis of the entire European food system. So all the inputs, all the outputs, all the food waste that are generated at European level. Then there is the support of LCA in the assessing of the food waste prevention targets, but also the role of LCA in assessing options for the byproducts valorization. So if we say from the food food production, from the food supply chain, if we have certain byproducts, which kind of valorization we can do. And then I will illustrate two examples that are, let's say, entirely LCA based. One at macro scale, the consumption footprint, which is a set of indicator life cycle based to try to understand at macro scale what is the performance of the food system, but also making a first attempt to assess the sustainability along the lines of what has been said before, so compared to limits of the planet. And then the product environmental footprint, so the efforts ongoing to qualify and to make more robust the evaluation of products. So let's start with the material flow analysis. This is a study we are conducting since many years. This is I hope you know, it's a Sankey diagram. The idea is to be able to model at the EU scale and also at the member state scale over time. So with the time trends, how the food system is evolving. So how much we are importing, how much we are producing as primary production, then how much we are processing. And so for the primary production, of course, you might have something that is consumed fresh or something that is transformed. So how much we are relying more and more on transformed food or even on pre-prepared food. Then the retail, and then the consumption, how much we consume at home, how much we rely on food services, how much we depend on certain elements related to the food services. And then, of course, there is also the aspect of the waste, but not only the waste that we are generating after the consumption, but also all the waste that are happening as the small arrows that you see coming from the different system years in terms of waste per se or byproducts that are coming along the entire supply chain. Without life cycle thinking or without an approach that is addressing the supply chain, also the assessment of the generation of waste wouldn't be the same. And for example, we can see for Italy, the projection of the timeline 2000-2018, we more or less remain around the same amount, but we can have an analysis, a possibility really to enter and understanding also the drivers of the food generated in the different stages. So in the primary production, in the production and manufacturing, and so on and so forth. So as it was said, food waste is, I would say, yes, another moral challenge for us, because we know how much is needed to produce the food. And at a certain point, we realize 1/3 of our food is wasted. And the waste is happening all along the life cycle with a great contribution of the consumption phase in developed countries, because in developing countries, the situation of the share is different and is more related to something that is lost in the primary production and in the distribution and retail. But anyway, if we take our lens as European, so in a developed countries, the majority is the consumption. So it's really something we are paying for and then we just throw away. So now one of the action of the Farm to Fork is to assess the best practice in preventing the consumer food waste. So how we can set targets that will be part of the overall revision of the Waste Framework Directive on the prevention of the waste. And also trying to have as much as possible the individual specificity of the different member states in the generation of this waste. And this is basically what the Parliament was asking with this Consumer Food Waste Forum, where it is possible really to see all the characteristic of the generation of the waste by the different member states, but also which kind of action has been put in place for the prevention of food waste. Now, why we need LCA here? Basically, we need LCA to ensure that when we are preventing the food, we are not generating trade-offs or additional harm. Because in many cases, we have, for example, actions of distribution, where we have a very complex logistic of recovery some food that in quantity is not so much. So we have to see if I recover 1 kilogram of lettuce with a lorry, maybe refrigerated lorry, instead of having that thrown away and going for composting, if maybe every element of the system that I'm creating for this prevention is then generating more impact, for example, more emissions of CO2 or particulate matter or whatever. So we created a calculator that can be downloaded, in which it's possible to compare the LCA profile of the food that you are recovering with the cost of the logistics or the intervention of your action. Then I was mentioning the use of LCA in relation to the valorization of the food waste, because again, there is a very vast literature on green chemistry. Whatever it's a food waste that can become part an interesting material ingredient for cosmetic, for nutraceutical, for pharmaceutical. But the complex biochemical transformation that are needed to reach the adequate quality of the ingredient for the uses, it's actually something that is not coming without impacts, and that it's the question if these value-added products are really green. And this is again where the JRC is working to give guidance on the evaluation, especially using prospective LCA, because very often these are products just at the laboratory scale, not already in the market. Then I mentioned this macro scale with the consumption footprint platform. This is a platform you can access where you can see the impacts in different areas of consumption, Professor Notar Nicola was involved in establishing the part on the food, where you can monitor the trend over time, and you can also compare the food system and all the other systems against the planetary boundaries. This of the planetary boundaries is something that is not part of the business as usual of the life cycle. Is something that now, with the so-called absolute sustainability, is moving fast in being introduced in LCA, but basically is to look at the different environmental impact categories compared to a carrying capacity of the ecosystem. So something complex, but I think that is going along the line of what was said before, to go beyond the mere performance and start looking if this is sustainable or not. So in that platform, you can assess or identify which are the hotspot of byproduct groups at the food system level, and also which are the impacts on certain domains, for example, on biodiversity. Then, of course, remain the problem of comparing two products on the market, product A and product B. That is what we are supporting via the product environmental footprint. And here the idea is again to move beyond the carbon footprint only, to be able to address the different impact categories that are actually, especially if we look at the food, very important to be considered. And as you probably know, there are a number of product environmental category rule completed for food-related items, and one is ongoing, and also the afternoon session will be very important there to see what is going on the LCA for the marine system. And here, this is more an invitation for you to join. There is an agricultural working group in the product environmental footprint with a number of different milestones that is really starting from the reflection of what we miss to have a better modeling of the agricultural system. And then I'm going towards the conclusion, just mentioning two key elements. One is the great challenge of the sustainability labeling of food. There is a proliferation of voluntary schemes, in many cases something that is just pushed by marketing campaign, by industry, so where the reliability of the information is really under threat. And here the Farm to Fork is about to propose a system to really empower consumers to make the choices. And this is somehow related to the green public procurement. So the possibility of having not only the criteria that are already available for food and catering, but additional criteria based on the LCA. So I leave you reading the conclusion. Are just a few points on what I said on the role of life cycle thinking and assessment. And I hope there is at least 1 minute for one question. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any questions or Italian, English? Italian? As you want. There is one there.
È proprio in fondissimo.
Quindi
il minuto si perde, sono andata a prendere la domanda.
Yes, it's a long time to reach.
Good morning. My question is, we actually see during the time that sustainability came up as an option for farmers that it requires knowledge and research. And I was wondering, what is your opinion about the idea that sustainability is not something, sustainable production is not something that can be easily followed by small and medium agriculture activities? It's something that requires capital and knowledge to be applied, and something that is turning more towards the large companies, and they are able to apply it, so the others are left outside of it, not getting any money to invest for it, and then eventually they will just disappear.
Okay, on this I have two quick answers, in the sense just two points of reflection. One point is for sure on the role, the identification of the key players in the food system. There was an interesting study in the Netherlands on the key actors, where aspects related, for example, on big companies and retailers as the one that can influence a cultural shift Usually in LCA, we look at two numbers. With the first presentation on statistics, we want a number that is super robust. Yes, but here it's mainly a cultural shift. And the cultural shift, the role is not only a policy asking for certain requirements, but how much the supply chain and the big players in the supply chain may act on their demand, on their supplier. So this is for sure something that in certain countries is already in place, where a retailer is start asking to the supplier certain type of information, certain type of requirements, moving this system. The other reflection very quickly is really on the role of the knowledge. Again, this is mainly a cultural shift. So the issue is the other components, let's say, of what is under my commissary, Maria Gabriel, which is how much we are able to instill in our education system, not only for those that has an environmental background or a background that is related, let's say, to topics that can be applied from the technical point of view, but more generally, this kind of really knowledge. So, for example, someone that is following not a university, but a professional school, but still with this professional school also in the agricultural domain, might have then an influence in their own business. So I think this is really more a cultural challenge today than a challenge on numbers.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Other question?
Let me check if we have
there is one from
The chat.
at home.
No. I have a question for Serenella. Thank you very much, Serenella, for your presentation. This morning we have talked about data, about the availability of data, all the problem of uncertainties and variability that database and data provided can give. So what GRC is doing in this field in the Farm to Fork project?
Okay, so there are, there is a long history of support for the data challenge, especially in terms of setting the rules. So on the command nomenclature, on the format, on the interoperability. Now, one of the big challenge ahead of us is actually the production of data like the one that is in your print project. So a more bottom-up production and an integration of this data in a system that is reliable. Why? Because we all know there are big players producing commercial database, but this, for the type of challenge we have ahead, is not enough. And we have also to rely on information that has a certain regional granularity, certain temporal granularity, and so on and so forth. So here, GRC is, so we are not producing data ourselves. We are mainly supporting the discussion at the Commission level, so not only DG Environment, but also DG Sante, because it's the chef de file of the Farm to Fork is DG Sante, on the data governance. So what can be in future the ideal data governance for life cycle data? And I'm thinking of something like what happened with the REACH regulation. I don't know if you are familiar with that. It's a regulation for chemicals, in which basically you have individual companies filling dossiers on chemicals with chemical properties, with toxicological properties. But the idea there is that who is providing the data remain responsible of the data. Of course, you might have evaluation, sample evaluations to see if the data are good or bad, but where really the responsibility on the data is a shared responsibility. This is one of the big discussion ongoing and one of the big challenge also for the scientific world to contribute, to see how projects like these are not projects like the one you are doing is not just interesting, but is becoming really a piece of the puzzle.
Grazie.